Well, good evening, everybody. So excited to have you here. Welcome to the Levi and Catharine Coffin State Historic Site. My name's Joanna Hahn. I'm the Central Region Director for the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites and Site Manager here at the Coffin site. So thank you for joining us this evening as we celebrate an honor given to Catharine Coffin as one of the 10 historic figures the U.S. Postal Service has recognized with its new series of Underground Railroad Forever stamps. These courageous men and women, including Catharine, were instrumental in aiding thousands of freedom seekers or enslaved people on their journey to freedom. Catharine, along with her husband Levi, called Fountain City, Indiana, their home from 1826 to 1847. In that 20-year period, the Coffins used their home as a safe house and was one of many locations in the Underground Railroad network that enslaved people encountered on a risky and sometimes perilous journey north towards freedom. In their home, which is located next door and is part of the historic site, the Coffins gave shelter and aided up to 100 freedom seekers each year. In all, they're credited with helping more than 1,000 people escape the horrors of slavery. When Levi and Catharine chose to move to Cincinnati, Ohio, they continued their tireless work. This time, they are on the front line of the Underground Railroad, where it began for many at the Ohio River. Here, both Levi and Catharine incorporated their Underground Railroad work with that of their daily routine, often taking great risks. Catharine was known to many of those individuals as Aunt Katie. In the midst of her role as both wife and mother, Catharine dedicated much of her time to sheltering, clothing, feeding, and caring for many. Along with her dedication to the Underground Railroad, she was also a public advocate during her early years in the anti-slavery movement here in Indiana and later in Ohio. We're proud to tell Catharine's story here at the State Historic Site, where thousands of visitors from around the country come to learn about the purpose of the Underground Railroad and to see one of the best provenanced historic houses tied to this important American story. So I'm going to now introduce Kathy Faree, who's President and CEO of the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites.
Thank you. It never gets old to hear that story. And the reason we get to be here tonight is because, as we fondly refer to as the sisters, have spent more than 40 years, Janice and Sandra, making sure that this site would be here today. And the work that Joanna has done alongside them to make sure that Catharine's story gets told. And that is a huge step forward. So tonight, I get to thank you and get to thank Joanna that we are here tonight that you have done all of this work so that we can be present to honor Catharine. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We also have a member of our board with us tonight, Mary Walker. She supports us endlessly and this site is very near and dear to her. So she is excited as we are to be here this evening. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, we will turn it over to Mark, and he will do the special conversation about the stamps, and then we'll do an unveiling. Mark.
Thank you, Kathy. And hello, I am Mark Thornburg. I'm the postmaster of the Richmond Post Office and of our associate office, the Fountain City Post Office as well. And I want to thank you, sisters, for doing the work to keep this alive. I actually visited here when I was a child on a school tour, and so that was many, many years ago. But on behalf of the U.S. Postal Service, I am pleased to present our new Forever Stamps commemorating the Underground Railroad, the secret network of individuals who helped thousands of slaves escape to freedom before the Civil War ended in 1865. Martin Luther King said the Underground Railroad symbolized hope when freedom was almost an impossible dream. The Underground Railroad stamps recognize the courage of the people who resisted slavery. Most remained anonymous, but some left their mark on history. I am honored, very honored, to participate in this special event to celebrate Catharine Coffin and other operatives of the Underground Railroad. The stamps portray 10 of these men and women, some more well-known, such as Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who demonstrated the power of collective action and solidarity in achieving social change, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. You will notice on the painted stamp's reverse side a map showing the general routes freedom seekers followed, along with text from the National Park Service describing the Underground Railroad network to freedom. We hope the Underground Railroad stamps will inspire you to learn more about this important part of our nation's history, and they are also available at your local post office, on USPS.com, and also in the gift shop here at the museum. So now, if I could ask Supervisor from Richmond Post Office, Shonda Stanley, and Richmond Post Office Clerk, Judy Kiros, to help present the stamp. On behalf of the Postal Service, we now
Our future leader.
we now present the Underground Railroad stamp. Thank you.
So we're happy to take any questions. As Mark noted, we do have the stamps for sale this evening if that's something you want to do, but the local post offices have them as well and online. But if anybody had any questions, either about the stamp itself, which would be Mark, or about Catherine, we're happy to answer those questions.
We want one for Levi.
Oh, you want one for Levi? One thing at a time, James.
Yes.
I'm just excited as Catherine myself.
Yes.
So very excited as Catherine. But yes, Levi is just as deserving. So, all right.
Awesome, they're being recognized.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Jenna, you want to tell a little bit about the recognition you're getting for them in the fall?
Sure. So it's kind of becoming a big year for the Coffins themselves, along with the postage stamp recognition. Later this fall, both Levi and Catherine will be inducted in the National Abolition Hall of Fame. In fact, along with several of these individuals that are on the stamps, they're also in that Hall of Fame as well. So that will be happening in October. The National Abolition Hall of Fame is in Peterborough, New York, where Garrett Smith, who is on there, I think, was there for the founding and the beginning of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. That's where it was founded. So that's why the Hall of Fame is there. There's a museum there. So the Coffins, both Levi and Catherine, I just want to note, they rarely induct two people that are nominated by the same person or organization, but they very much recognize that we work tirelessly to tell Levi and Catherine's story together, and so they felt it was important that they both should be recognized in the same class the same year. They do that every other year. They normally induct 4 people, so to get that recognition and for them both to get it at the same time is a very big deal. So. All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's been kind of a long day for me, and this is the cap of the day, so I don't want to keep anyone longer than needed. So good evening. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time. My name is Joanna Hahn, for those who don't know me. I'm the Central Region Director for the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites. And excited to share with you tonight someone that has become sort of a little bit of our celebrity lately, and that's Catharine Coffin. It is Women's History Month, and so one thing that I want to try to do more here at the site is maybe every March to do a program around women in the Underground Railroad. So of course it just makes sense. We'll kick off with Catherine's story. Now, my goal for the presentation tonight, of course, is to highlight Catherine's experience, both with the Underground Railroad, but also as someone invested in supporting the anti-slavery movement, both here in Indiana, Ohio. I've had a chance to start really thinking more about Catherine's story and experience. Last year, I got to write an article for a magazine called History News, and really talking about the evolution of how we've interpreted Catherine's story and that experience here at the site. And so that's just kind of where I thought, okay, let's just keep going and see what we can do here in better understanding her, as I said, her experience. But it's not an easy story to always tell when you are focusing on someone where the only primary resource we really have of her life and story comes from her husband, not from herself. So I like to say that Catharine has a silent voice, but it doesn't mean she was a silent individual. So I'm going to break down Catharine's life in 5 periods. First, from 1803, that was the year she was born, to 1826, and that was her life in North Carolina. 1826 to 1847, her life here in Indiana. Then in 1847 to 1859, life in Cincinnati. 1859 to 1865, back to Indiana. So if anybody's familiar with Catharine's story, that might seem a little intriguing. So we'll get there, but that's the period of the Civil War years. Janice is staring at me already. And then 1865 to 1881, life post-Civil War. So, all right. So looking at that first period, 1803 to 1826, we're looking at her youth, her early marriage primarily. And if there's any period of her life we probably know the least about, it would be this period. Now, especially before her marriage to Levi in 1824. As I mentioned, his book, Reminiscences, is the only source really that we have that focuses on this time in her life. And it doesn't go into too much detail, other than that her family, the Whites, being friends of the Coffins. So Catharine was born Catharine White. So Catharine was born on September 10th, 1803, and her parents are Stanton and Sarah White. And she was born in Guilford County, North Carolina. So the county there is pictured. And right there in that blue square is where the New Garden monthly meeting was located. And both Levi and Catharine's families were members of that meeting. Levi and Catharine most likely grew up around 5 miles from each other. As I mentioned, both families were the members of that monthly meeting, which left plenty of chances for their 2 families to interact. Levi gives no mention of Catharine's childhood or upraising, but he notes, quote, "Our attachment to each other was of long standing. She was an amiable and attractive young woman of lively, buoyant spirits." The closest I have come to any other source that speaks of Catharine's youth is actually from one of her obituaries that just stated that she, quote, "didn't have the advantages of much early education." Levi said they both saw eye to eye on the issue of slavery, and Catharine grew up in a home with similar beliefs to Levi. Her father, Stanton, is listed in Levi's book as being sympathetic and willing to harbor runaway slaves in his home in North Carolina. And though Levi only points to one instance of the White family's participation, if they did so once, it's easy to assume this may have happened multiple times. Catharine herself surely saw some of the same scenes that Levi describes in his book. He speaks of slave coffles being driven down nearby roads, seeing and witnessing families who are forced to separate due to the sale as slaves and other matters, beatings and mistreatment of individuals as well that were enslaved. So Catharine must have also been aware of how Levi's family sheltered freedom seekers and how Levi's cousin Vestal developed and supported what may have been the first Underground Railroad effort recorded in North Carolina. Catharine and Levi were married at the Hopewell Meeting House on October 28, 1824. Catharine was 21 years old and Levi 26. Levi intended to be a farmer. But in 1825, he agreed to take on a teaching position, and he and Catharine were provided a home at no charge. That same year, Levi's parents migrated to Wayne County, Indiana, here to what today is Fountain City. And by September 25th, 1825, their first child, Jesse, is born. So Catharine becomes a mother. Then by September 1826, the next year, Levi and Catharine and their 1-year-old son leave North Carolina to settle in Wayne County. So as I said, not much to share too much with that particular section or time of her life. Now, of course, here at the site, we focus on our main period, the next period, from 1826 to 1847. It's during this era of Catharine's life that we start to see her as a staunch and tireless partner in the Underground Railroad. But what else is in Catharine's life in this period? The remaining of her 5 children are born, and we cannot, of course, discount her role as a mother. But was there a life outside of the home? Catharine was part of the formation of a women's anti-slavery society and met some of the earliest abolition figures to visit the emerging Midwest. Surely at times where Levi is, Catharine is by his side. But there were also times when Catharine was independent of Levi, both socially and in some of the work accomplished with the Underground Railroad. So we'll explore a little bit of that. Catharine and Levi made their first home not in the house next door. So they actually lived just a block down the street in what they called Main and Main Cross Streets here in town. Today, the Pizza King now stands on that property. So I have to tell school kids to use their imagination of what that may have looked like, but that was also the location of the first dry goods store that he opened here in town. And it's important to note that Fountain City was known as Newport. So in that period, most of their lives, they knew it as Newport. So if I speak of Newport, I'm still speaking of Fountain City. Though the dry goods store created an income for the family, Levi expanded into other businesses, which included purchasing a mill and starting a pork packing business. So Levi stays busy outside the home. Catherine's managing the household and the children. But despite both Levi and Catherine being easily engaged in their lives, Levi mentions that Newport attracted runaway slaves and speaks of their home, quote, on the line of the Underground Railroad. The Coffins felt compelled to help anyone who arrived looking for shelter or help, and in those early years, the Coffin home was the only available in the community to find such help. Catherine does not seem fazed by this new duty, as Levi describes her that, quote, he knew that my wife's feelings and sympathies regarding this matter were the same as mine and that she was willing to do her part. And that statement from Levi's book is our real first connection of Catherine and her ties to the Underground Railroad. Levi portrays the arrival of freedom seekers to the Coffin home as a continuous stream of passengers, and as a result, there was always much to do to be prepared when woken at night. Though Levi speaks to both he and his wife working together in the care of those who came weekly, he clearly states in his book that, quote, it was never too cold or stormy, or the hour of night too late for my wife to rise from sleep and provide food and comfortable lodging for the fugitives. Her sympathy for those in distress never tired, and her efforts in their behalf never abated. Now, Catherine surely empathized with many who came to the Coffin home to be able to spend so much of what little downtime she had. Remember, she's a mom, taking care of a house, but what little downtime she had in the care and comfort of freedom seekers. Between 1828 and 1843, as I mentioned, Catherine gave birth to 5 more children. Their sons, Addison and Thomas and Henry, and their two youngest children, their daughters, Anne and Sarah. 2 of those children, Addison and Thomas, died at very young ages, surely creating feelings of deep loss for both parents. Catherine encountered women who escaped slavery who themselves had tragedy in their lives regarding their own children. Some who chose to leave their children behind due to escaping slavery or the loss of their child through forced separation, never to know what happened to them. Surely Catherine provided not just a sympathetic ear for those women, but a safe space for them that the Coffins, as they met the Coffins over the years. And just when Catherine may have had a chance maybe to get the household back together and to normal, the next train, as they said, would arrive. Fergus Bordewich, who is a historian who wrote a book called Bound for Canaan, goes into many details of Levi and Catherine's experience. But Fergus, like many historians, often see Levi as the efficient manager, who was good at coordinating supplies and people while being able to stand up to the risks of the job. But he fails, in my mind, to see that so much of this success is because Catherine was behind a good part of it. I like to say Levi may have been the one who knew how to get things, but I feel it was Catherine that knew what to do with it when the time came. Looking at their home in the house that is now part of the historic site, it was built in 1839, so the picture of the house on the screen, and Levi and Catherine intended this to be their forever home. We can suppose that both Levi and Catherine had an opinion into the home's construction. And sometimes when I give tours, I won't speak for my staff, but when I give tours, I joke that Levi paid for the castle, but it's Catherine who ran it. So why wouldn't Catherine have a say in its design? The basement kitchen, if you're familiar with the house, there's a basement level in the back side of the house, and I feel that could be a clue with Catherine giving this opinion of how this could work better for them in this design. Because the kitchen is designed for women's work. I can't imagine Levi saying, let's add this basement kitchen, let's do this. Who's using it? Catherine's the one, okay? And I feel that when Levi and Catherine decided to build this home, it was apparent perhaps that the number of freedom seekers that they were assisting had been increasing. And as a result, so would be the individuals chasing or looking for them, as Levi would call slave catchers. So why not build a home that allowed the Coffins to help better conceal who they helped and how? Though it cannot be proven through any sources, this is something that we may never find answers to. But perhaps Catherine felt it was an advantage to have the second kitchen under the home to allow for the better care of anyone who came late at night. To not just cook, but to store extra food, clothing, shoes, and the other resources the Coffins were known for providing in the care. This allowed the Coffins, and really Catherine, to be better prepared for anything, including a group of 17 that show up on an early morning who need fed, and as I said, clothed, and whatever needs were needed. It kind of looks a little apparent that you're feeding a lot of people at a time of day that people tend not to be doing those type of activities. So again, it's possible that basement kitchen helped to provide that safety. Over time, Levi became known as the president of the Underground Railroad, but it is in this period of life in Indiana that Catherine became Aunt Katie. Another historian, Peggy Siegel, who's written several articles on Quaker women in Indiana, gives Catherine credit for her tireless devotion. She's clear that credit is due to Levi, but that, quote, the work was clearly a family effort. Catharine Coffin assumed much of the responsibility in feeding, hiding, and disguising the fugitives in their home. And she goes on to note that if Levi is the so-called president, then shouldn't Catherine be seen as the executive vice president? I think Catherine was satisfied with the title of Aunt Katie. It's important to also understand that there were periods when Catherine kept those trains running without Levi. There's several occasions in his book where Levi speaks of traveling. The longest stretch of absence, most likely, is in the fall 1844 through that winter into 1845, when Coffin went to Canada with another Quaker named William Beard, someone he associated with in the Underground Railroad. That is many months being gone. And Catherine, most likely, was the one focused on keeping that home open, relying perhaps on some neighbors to help, because over time our community came around with what the Coffins were doing and were assisting in other ways. And most likely there were moments when Catherine was on her own when those slave catchers came to town. And though Levi claimed the homes they lived in over the course of their life in association with the Underground Railroad were never searched, he and Catherine still took precautions when potential trouble arose. It seems Catherine's chosen place to hide freedom seeker was in the beds, in between mattresses, not in mattresses, but in between a top and bottom mattress. And it's not clear how often this happened or when it was needed, but Catherine had to be adept at managing situations when potential problems came knocking on the door. Levi and Catherine may have been responsible for one of the busiest Underground Railroad depots in the country during this period here in Indiana, if not at least in the West. Going back to Fergus Bordowich, one of the things that I take the most from his book, and I never thought about it this way until I reread it, is that it may have been the busiest center of illegal activity in the state of Indiana during this period of history. We have to remember what the Coffins have chosen to do is considered illegal. So though Levi and Catherine eventually came not to bear this burden alone within the town of Newport, they both, and I highlight both, must be credited for what it became. So looking at this next phase, or not next phase, but this idea of what was life outside the home, or the possibility of a life outside the home for Catherine. Much of what we focus on in our interpretation here at the site is Catherine's role maintaining the Underground Railroad home. But Catherine and some of the female Quakers here in Newport did become public advocates for immediate emancipation. Quaker communities like Newport became early testing grounds for what was the beginning of the changing roles of women in America. The founding of female anti-slavery societies, the gathering of women in sewing circles, coordinating anti-slavery bazaars, supporting free labor goods, and publishing and the reading of anti-slavery newspapers all played a part in women helping women find a voice in this fight against slavery. Levi considered himself an abolitionist. I can assume that Catherine felt the same. But in doing so, women like Catherine would cross a line into the political discussions around slavery at the time. Before I spoke to Catherine's empathy to women she aided on the Underground Railroad, and it is the same empathy that brought many other women into the abolition debates of the 1830s and 1840s. With these feelings of connectiveness, white abolitionist women felt strongly that they could use both religious and moral suasion to get more men behind the anti-slavery cause. Women became a silent majority through the formation of female anti-slavery societies. And there were a few things that happened here in Newport first to help encourage women like Catherine to feel that they could form such a group. In 1838, the Indiana Anti-Slavery Society formed in Wayne County. Not long after, Quaker Arnold Buffum arrived as an agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society and encouraged local Quaker communities in Indiana and Ohio to form their own auxiliary associations, or societies, The Newport Anti-Slavery Society formed in 1840, and by the spring of 1841, the first meeting of the Newport Female Anti-Slavery Society took place at the Newport Meeting House just north of here, and Catharine was a member. When looking at the Newport Female Anti-Slavery Society minutes, we can get a glimpse of what was discussed in some of the meetings. So they're recording what they're discussing and what they're focusing on. Many of the members were of Newport's Quaker females, though how large the membership was is unknown. The Newport Female Anti-Slavery Society provided a safe space for women in the community to publicly discuss anti-slavery issues and create public statements or addresses as a group. And by doing so, more women would feel empowered to be bolder in their feelings about slavery. These meetings also allowed women in the community to hear from other advocates, often men, but sometimes other women. Local anti-slavery advocates of both Indiana and Ohio spoke at their meetings, which included Wesleyan minister Daniel Worth, who was also president of the State Anti-Slavery Society. And when looking at who served as the officers of the society, unfortunately, Catharine's name does not come up. But one role Catharine was deeply involved in with this particular group was the formation in support of a sewing circle. Sewing circles were common female gatherings where often clothing and quilting and other sewing projects were accomplished by a group of women in a short amount of time. The Newport Sewing Circle focused on providing handmade clothing and blankets, and I can imagine maybe even knitted goods as well, for freedom seekers. Levi Coffin speaks to how busy the winter months were for the arrival of freedom seekers through the Underground Railroad, and as a result, the needs for clothing and other handmade goods increased during the colder months. There were times when money was needed to obtain these type of materials in order to purchase in bulk to be able to make things like clothing. And to help, the sewing circle sold handmade goods, most likely made with materials already in hand, such as rag carpets and bonnets. And through this group, which often met in the Coffin home next door, Catharine had what was surely a close, tight-knit relationship with some of the female members. The sewing circle, I feel, is an interesting meeting point between Catharine's life in her home and her Underground Railroad activities and that of her more public life. Perhaps this was a moment for some girl time, okay? Maybe to let off some steam of the constant demands of her daily routine. I'm a mom of 3 kids, so I'm not sure how she was able to do it 200 years ago. But with these gatherings, Catharine played hostess and strengthened any bond she had with other members. The Newport Female Anti-Slavery Society also had the opportunity to engage in other activities when things such as anti-slavery conventions took place. Our town, Newport, hosted public anti-slavery meetings as early as the winter of 1841. Neighboring communities such as Economy, Richmond, Salem, and Union County, and Greensboro, and Henry County were other locations where anti-slavery gatherings took place where women like Catharine were encouraged to attend. And it is at these meetings where Catharine potentially heard from abolitionists such as John Waddles and Jonathan Cable, who were both of Ohio, or those from the East, as Levi says, including Arnold Buffum, who I mentioned before. He was a Quaker from Rhode Island. He helped to co-found the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Charles Burleigh, who was from Connecticut. James Fuller, who was out of New York, and he also is associated with the Underground Railroad history there. And Frederick Douglass, who at that time was situated in Massachusetts. And we know in 1843 he visited here in the Coffin home. We don't know what happened in that visit, but we know that he was here. So several of these individuals, as I mentioned, with people like Douglass, Buffum, we know, for instance, were hosted in the Coffin home. The opportunities to hear from these speakers gave Catharine a chance to pay attention to the events of the world outside the home. Sewing circles and the selling of goods to fundraise, along with campaigning to other women to join groups like the Female Anti-Slavery Society, offered women a chance to learn new skills in organizing. And one of the movements that men and women in Newport also supported over the course of the 1840s was free labor, which is the abstaining of purchasing slave-made goods. As early as 1841, I found advertisements for free labor goods being available in our town of Newport. And by 1844, Levi himself went full free labor in his dry goods store, meaning anything he sold in that store, he was guaranteeing was never touched by slave hands. For the women in the Newport Female Anti-Slavery Society, they had no toleration for those who purchased slave-made goods. This is the masthead for the Free Labor Advocate, an Anti-Slavery Chronicle, which was a newspaper that was edited and printed here in Newport. And in several of the minutes from the women's group was published here and shared. In one statement that the group published in the newspaper, is quoted as saying, "Those abolitionists especially who profess the doctrine of abstinence from the products of slave labor, and at the same time purchase such articles without an absolute necessity to do so, or give them the preference on account of their superior quality, or because they please the fancy better, or are cheaper than similar articles of free labor produce, do in fact cast a stumbling block in the ways of others and bring a reproach upon the truth." So for many of these women, really one of the themes that they focused the most on in their advocacy is the free labor movement. Catharine was probably the greatest advocate for what her husband was supporting in his business, as it not only drove customers to the family business, but she could easily help women of her community understand how free labor helped to challenge slavery on an economic level. To sum up this part, Catharine became a tremendous organizer during this period living in Indiana. Not only was she focused on managing a home for her family, but she also managed to organize women and resources to address the needs of freedom seekers. Though we can't count much of this time as a partnership of work between Levi and Catharine, there are ways in which Catharine independently and courageously kept the trains going during Levi's periodic absences. And these skills will prove important in helping her adapt to a new life in Cincinnati. So by early 1847, Levi and Catharine have made a life decision. Levi was lobbied to relocate to Cincinnati to open a free labor warehouse to help small merchants like himself acquire free labor goods more easily. Now, Levi hesitated several times when being asked, but accepted on the third time. And he never explains why the third time, but the third time is when he said yes. And so with that, Levi and Catharine and their remaining children relocated to Cincinnati. Levi and Catharine believed this to be temporary when they moved to a home on the corner of 6th and Elm Streets, a 3-story building, which is pictured here, which also incorporated Levi's store and warehouse. Coffin notes in his book that he had no intention of getting involved in the Underground Railroad. He and Catharine were not in the business of putting down roots in the city. They hoped that once the warehouse operated sustainably, they could return to their lives in Indiana. But at some point, the Coffins came to realize they could play a role in the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati. With a large home containing multiple floors, the Coffins were able to conceal freedom seekers. The choice to remain involved in the Underground Railroad, though, while living in Cincinnati, meant taking greater risks. In a city located along the Ohio River, with a population that swelled to well over 100,000 people by 1850, it was an attractive place for enslaved Africans to escape, but it also made it a target for slave hunters. Both Levi and Catharine adopted new tactics, or developed, I don't know if adopted is the right word, maybe developed new tactics when working with runaways. In Newport, some freedom seekers remained for days or even months without fear of slave catchers. But in Cincinnati, there were periods where it was too dangerous to linger for just a few hours. Levi and Catharine used their daily routine as an opportunity to operate the Underground Railroad in their home without arousing suspicions. When Levi describes Catharine's approach, he says that she, quote, had a quiet, unconcerned way of going about her work as if nothing unusual was at hand. Unconcerned way of going about, at hand, which was calculated to lull every suspicion of those who might be watching, and who would have been at once aroused by a sign of secrecy or mystery. Catharine's become an actress, I think. It was not unusual for Catharine to deliver food to hidden freedom seekers while appearing to do the laundry, or to dress a woman as a man or a man as a woman, whatever could help create a decoy to keep slave hunters off track. Catharine even went as far as dressing herself in the fashionable clothing of the period, which is very un-Quaker-like for a female at that time, when she had a young freedom seeker who needed taken to another safe house in the city. The young girl was dressed in an outfit of a maid and given a bundle of clothing to create the appearance of carrying a baby. When the two walked outside, no one seemed to question this high society woman and her nursemaid. Activities such as these perhaps were unconceivable when living in the staunch Quaker community of Newport, but in the metropolis of Cincinnati, Catharine seems perhaps willing to push aside Quaker propriety to get the job done. With another historian, Julie Rowe Joffrey, who wrote a book called The Great Silent Army of Abolitionism, she makes the point that, quote, women who took an active part in the work needed to be flexible, committed, discreet, energetic, and organized. On occasion, they had to be daring and be able to carry off deceptions. She goes on to speak of Catharine as being the best example of this, although she never calls her Catharine Coffin in the book. She's always Mrs. Coffin. or Mrs. Levi Coffin, or wife of Levi Coffin, never Catharine Coffin. But Joffrey does establish that Catharine is operating with a certain authority that I'm sure doesn't always rely on the opinion or perhaps permission of Levi. By 1856, Coffin's free labor warehouse has closed, and as a result, he and Catharine moved to a 30-room home on the corner of Franklin and Broadway streets in Cincinnati, which is pictured here. They operated a boarding house, which often housed local teachers and anti-slavery supporters, and continued, though, their Underground Railroad work. The third floor was a convenient place for freedom seekers to hide and rest during the day, while movement in and out happened under cover of darkness, often without any of their boarders knowing what was going on. Other aspects of their lives did not slow down, but only sped up. Like at their home in Newport, the Coffins became involved in anti-slavery organizations. And though many male activists contributed to Cincinnati's growing acceptance of abolition, women were a driving force behind the organization of anti-slavery events. One of the prominent figures in Cincinnati's public fight against slavery came with the arrival of Sarah Otis Ernst in 1841. Unfortunately, there's no picture of Sarah, or else I'd provide that. Sarah was eager to get involved in the anti-slavery organizations of Cincinnati, but found them to be unsatisfactory. She felt they did not go far enough in pushing the slavery debate. By the time Levi and Catharine arrived in Cincinnati, Sarah was already on the mission to rally Cincinnatians to be more vocal and active against slavery. One group Sarah was involved in was the Cincinnati Anti-Slavery Sewing Circle. And though Sarah grew to feel that the sewing circle didn't create enough impact towards change, she did bring with her a group of reputable Cincinnati ladies as new members. The sewing circle all met in the Coffin home on a weekly basis, as Catharine organized the distribution of what was created to freedom seekers. And we can see evidence that not just well-to-do white females, but also black females contributed to the sewing circle. One is a woman named Catherine Kitty Dorham. She was a reputable Cincinnati seamstress who was once enslaved. And along with maintaining an extremely profitable business, she was seen as one of the most accomplished Underground Railroad operatives in Cincinnati. Another was Sarah Fawcett, who you see pictured here with her husband, Peter. Peter had actually been one time enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, so as a young boy. Like Kitty, Sarah was a successful business owner, earning a living as a top hairstylist for the wealthy elite of Cincinnati. And Sarah, along with her husband Peter, were good friends with the Coffins and aided in Underground Railroad work as well. In all, it is estimated that at one time, the sewing circle had as many as 50 members and lasted 17 years. The sewing circle offered Catharine again a chance to meet and work with local women who supported emancipation, albeit a much different type of group than what she had worked with in Newport. Catharine herself managed extremely busy days, and the sewing circle, as I said with Newport, surely offered an opportunity to engage with other like-minded women in a safe space. We can also assume that there possibly was an element of fun, a chance to gossip and just connect, because if that's not part of the experience, women are not going to come back the next week to do the work. So there's got to be an aspect to that. But Catharine made sure to help keep the members grounded, and we're reminded by Catharine of the purpose of their weekly gatherings. In his book, Levi states that there was occasion when Catharine presented freedom seekers to the circle, allowing those freedom seekers to tell their stories of their escapes so that the women, again, could come to understand who they are providing that work for. The formation of the Sewing Society then led to the beginning of annual anti-slavery fairs in Cincinnati. With endorsement of newspapers such as the Cincinnati Gazette and the organizing efforts of Sarah Ernst, the anti-slavery fairs were considered a legitimate event worthy of any Cincinnatian's patronage. By the early 1850s, the fairs averaged sales of up to $4,000, which supported the organizing of anti-slavery conventions in the city and provided support to regional anti-slavery publications. And it's hard to know what type of presence Catharine may have had in perhaps the organizing or even attendance in these fairs, because I haven't been able to find any reference there. I can assume, though, if she could be involved in some way, she probably was. Catharine also surely rubbed elbows with abolitionists of both regional as well as national prominence when conventions took place, as Levi was often an attendee and sometimes aided in their planning. Some who attended these anti-slavery conventions in Cincinnati included William Wells Brown, who was a former slave, who is the first African-American male to publish a novel known as Clotel. George W. Julian, if you're familiar with Wayne County history, he is a native here. He was a state representative for our state. He helped to found the Free Soil Party and later served as U.S. representative for the state of Indiana. John Rankin, who Levi knew and worked with in Underground Railroad. He was out of Ripley, Ohio, and a Presbyterian minister. And as I mentioned Frederick Douglass before, the Coffins had an opportunity to interact with him again. I think it's like 1852, 1853, around there. He made his first journey to Cincinnati. When I often give tours and speak of Catharine's life in Newport, I remark that I cannot imagine that she got much rest if the home here in Indiana was as active as Levi claims. After moving to Cincinnati, I'm sure Catharine's life went into overdrive. The exhaustive nature of her work, the constant demand of her time, playing hostess to a boarding house of guests, while managing the ins and outs of freedom seekers surely took a toll. Through all of this, Catharine was still an active mother. I mentioned that those children that were still living had moved to Cincinnati with the Coffins, and both her daughters, Anne and Sarah, and for a time their son Henry, lived with them. And like what they saw in their early deaths of their two sons, the loss of a child was still a threat. In 1849, cholera killed around 6,000 residents in Cincinnati. Close friend and Underground Railroad supporter Laura Haviland speaks in her autobiography of Levi and Catharine's daughter Anne dying of that disease in July 1850. Though we're not aware of Levi or Catharine contracting the illness, I'm sure it was still a great worry to them, as their youngest daughter Sarah was only 7 at the time of that outbreak. Did a reason to ever leave Cincinnati present itself? The Coffins never intended to make it their home. Levi speaks of his detest for city life in his book. Was there ever a chance to take a break or do something different or even return to Indiana? Their original plan when they moved to Cincinnati was to come back to Indiana within 5 years, as long as they could make the business sustainable. Levi doesn't get personal in his autobiography and may have chosen to do so for a certain reason, but through other evidence, it seems that perhaps the Coffins have returned to Indiana, or at least Catharine, for a period, at least a period of dedicated time outside of Cincinnati. So let's explore that part of those years in Cincinnati. So this is from the Palladium item in 1898. It's a reprint of a letter that Levi Coffin wrote to a man named Daniel Huff, who was a resident here in Newport and Underground Railroad's supporter. And Levi, when I first saw this, when I was just getting started here and looking for anything about Levi Coffin, the detail I'm going to go into is not the one that caught my eye that I was interested in, because Levi goes into details about John Brown, the Harper's Ferry incident had happened. So I was paying more attention to that. But he gives an interesting detail in his letter. He and Catharine are looking to join the Driftwood monthly meeting. Recently, I came back to this detail because I was given some other evidence that it seems in 1866, the Coffins wished to transfer their membership from the Driftwood meeting, which I'll talk more about here in a minute, to the Cincinnati monthly meeting. And this is after the Civil War, so I have another connection there to this Driftwood meeting. Quakers transferring membership is not an odd thing, especially when moving from one place or one region to another. What is interesting about the Driftwood monthly meeting is that it is in Jackson County, Indiana. So, how do the Coffins come wanting membership in a monthly meeting in Jackson County, a membership that lasted for a period around 5 to 6 years during this period of the Civil War? Nothing in Levi's book speaks of this. If you read it as he portrays it, he and Catharine are still situated in Cincinnati and spend much of the Civil War period focused on aiding enslaved Africans freed by the Union Army, or those that were able to make it to Cincinnati during that period of the war. The 1860 census has Levi, Catharine, and daughter Sarah living in Cincinnati. So this winter, I thought I'm going to dig into this and see if I can figure it out. So I came back to this letter that Levi wrote to Daniel. And at the top, if you notice, it mentions Weddington, Indiana. Okay. So I started looking for Weddington, Indiana, which I've spent a lot of years working in the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites. I've heard a lot of names of a lot of small towns, but had never heard of a Weddington. So I had to figure this out. And I could not find a Weddington, Indiana. But I looked at a map of Jackson County. So hopefully what you can see here makes sense. This is Jackson County. And the box that is in the upper right hand is surrounding what is Reading Township. So from there, I found that there's an unincorporated town of Redington, not Weddington, but Redington. So perhaps somehow when this letter was getting transcribed for the newspaper, they misread the R for a W. All right. So then I thought, okay, so I have a possible location of where he was when he wrote this letter. So even though I had found in the 1860 census that the Coffins were living in Cincinnati, I decided let's look at the 1860 census for this township. And I don't know how easy it is to read this. I did my best to blow it up. But I found that their sons, Henry and Jesse, are both living in Reading Township in Readington. Okay. So there's the connection, all right? 2 of their children are now in Readington, Indiana. Levi and Catharine may have seen this perhaps as a short-term home if they are working to join this monthly meeting. And today, Sand Creek Azalea meeting is just north of Readington. So most likely that was the Quaker meeting that they would have been active in. So continuing to dig, why are Jesse and Henry in Jackson County, Indiana? And the earliest date I can connect them in Jackson County is 1857. In the Seymour Times newspaper, I have found several newspaper ads for a dry goods store they both operated in Readington. And as I mentioned, 1860 census with them both listed there, it does note that their son Henry is a clerk. So it is showing that he's probably the clerk working in the store. It seems, though, that by 1858, they might be in business with Dad. So here is an ad that says, look here, the firm of J.S. Coffin and Brother is this day dissolved by mutual consent, and the business will now be conducted under the firm of L. Coffin and Sons. So I guess I found perhaps at least a possible reason of why Levi and Catharine may have spent some time in Readington, Indiana. I'm losing my place because I'm getting off my script. Okay, so by the fall of, let me restart. It is apparent that in his book, if you go back to Levi's Stories in Cincinnati, he is spending much time in and out of Cincinnati, starting in 1860. By the fall of 1861, just months after the start of the Civil War, he's focused on aiding enslaved Africans at the front lines of the war. He's going south. In a timeline that I've been trying to build and keep of Levi and Catharine's life, it's hard to see what Catharine, though, is doing amongst this, okay? So Levi mentions, though, Union soldiers camping near the Coffin home, the boarding house I showed a picture of before, and that he and Catharine took in Union soldiers and cared for them. There's even a story of Catharine caring for a freedom seeker brought to their home dressed as a Union soldier. In 1862, the Coffins are going to move residences again during this period to a home on Werman Avenue in Cincinnati. In a letter, though, that I also found that Levi writes after his return trip, he's going to go to Europe in 1864-5, but basically he's gone a year. And there's a letter that he wrote on the return from that trip. And he speaks of taking a long break after the trip due to poor health. And that he spent most of the time, quote, in Indiana with my wife and daughter who had spent their time there in my absence. So with that letter, then Levi's saying, oh yeah, they're in Indiana. So he's not saying so in the book, but in his personal correspondence, he seems to be sharing that. So how much time was that really? Maybe Catharine was coming and going. It's hard to say. But regardless, when the war ended, they chose to remain in Cincinnati. So they do come back after the war and establish their life in Cincinnati. So by that summer, 1865, Levi's returned from his journey abroad, and he's starting to transition his attention to focus more on the post-war effort to continue aiding newly freed slaves. By 1868, their daughter Sarah passes of an unknown cause. And over the post-war years, Levi and Catharine witnessed the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ending slavery, establishing citizenship for all persons born in the United States, and allowing African-American men the right to vote. At a celebration of the passage of the 15th Amendment, Levi actually tells a crowd that he has resigned his position as president of the Underground Railroad. But Levi, again, like with the early years, doesn't give us much of a picture of the life he and Catharine lived in those post-war years. He pretty much ends the book in that speech he gives at the 15th Amendment. But in looking up some events that I can still tie the coffins to, one event that I wish to find a little more about is happened in the fall of 1874. This is an advertisement in the Richmond Weekly Palladium newspaper that is a call out for an anti-slavery reunion that is going to take place here in Newport. And so both Levi and Catharine came from Cincinnati. They attended the event. I found several newspaper articles that do remark on what happened, although it's not a complete record of probably everything that was said and who all spoke. But it's apparent the Coffins were a center of attention. Levi spoke to the crowd, and before he ended, gave recognition to Catharine's work, noting that, again, her title was Aunt Katie to many that they helped. Catharine received an ovation as she came forward during the recognition. They also had, at this meeting, the opportunity to meet another national figure, Sojourner Truth, who attended the event, and she did speak. She did make a speech, but again, I don't have necessarily a record of what she spoke or what she said. Not long after this event, they returned to Cincinnati, where they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary on October 28th. And the event was attended by many, including several Cincinnati abolitionists, both black and white. And at the event, they renewed their vows. Over the next few years, though, Levi will become ill. He dealt with vertigo and eventually passed in September of 1877. Catharine's remaining years were spent with Mary Ann Green, a woman of color who had worked for the Coffins at their home in Avondale, where they were living in the post-war years. Her son, Jesse, by this time had moved to Cincinnati and was living nearby. Through the sale of property owned by Levi and the commissions from the sales of his autobiography, Catharine was able to support herself. Catharine eventually passed on May 8, 1881. One obituary speaks of her to be, quote, a relic of the famous abolitionist Levi Coffin. But there are other obituaries that do a better job of singling out Catharine's work and contributions. One even giving us a taste of her personality, something no other resource contributes. So it reads, Mrs. Coffin was to the last a bright, cheerful woman, endowed with much conversational power and sense of the witty and humorous, and filled as was her mind with stirring reminiscences of the past. She was entertaining and instructive to all eager listeners. Yet despite any stories or memories she shared, no one interviewed her that I can find, and to my knowledge, ever asked her to write her reminiscences. The Cincinnati Daily Gazette goes further in its recognition of Catharine's Underground Railroad work at the time of her death, and it's possible this may have been written by someone that Catharine knew well. It says, the instances of coolness with which she baffled slave hunters and United States marshals are many, and her courteous good humor and obliging spirit made them ashamed to pry too closely into the affairs of the household. Mrs. Coffin would accompany her husband to the city, braving the danger of a mob and the violence of slave hunters. Mrs. Coffin was endowed with fine social qualities and possessing a retentive memory. She was a most interesting person to meet, and necessarily enjoyed a pretty wide circle of friends and acquaintances who loved to hear her recount the romantic incidents of her long and stirring life. She was of a most cheerful and hopeful temperament, quick at repartee, and possessed an inexhaustible fund of dry, quick humor. Without the advantages of much early education, I mentioned that before, she had an excellent judgment and was a quick observer. She was an honest, earnest Christian woman, acting always in all things from a firm sense of duty, and was noted among her wide circle of friends for consistency, stability, and firmness of religious purpose under all circumstances. When asked not very long prior to her death if she had any business matters to settle or directions to give, she answered, "No, I'm ready to go when the call comes. It is not dark to me. All my friends have gone, and I but go to them." In the years since the passing of Catharine, her story and work has slowly gained more recognition. In 1893, Cincinnati artist Charles Weber displayed his painting titled The Underground Railroad, which you see pictured here, at the Chicago World's Fair. And if you've never seen this painting in person, it is huge. Weber had known the Coffins during their years in Cincinnati and was determined to immortalize the Underground Railroad in a painting, and much talk came about such a large painting that seemed to have been painted from life. In fact, in an article published in the Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper, one gentleman was so taken by the painting, that it stirred up memories of his childhood. When he saw, quote, the face of the kind woman who was helping the old Negro, he saw his sainted mother and was sure that the man in the wagon was his father. He later contacted the artist to try to find out more about the subjects of the painting. Well, the man who wrote the letter and contacted Charles Weber was Levi and Catherine's own son, Henry. So today, this painting hangs in the galleries of the Cincinnati Museum of Art and is considered one of its most iconic pieces in its collection. Thousands of printed books and websites use this image when describing the Underground Railroad or trying to show a visual of it, although it's not often that the subjects of the painting are identified. So people normally don't know that that's who they're seeing here. Of course, Levi's book does give Catherine's contributions recognition, and thankfully an image of Catharine was included in the first editions of his book when printed. So with the painting and the image from Coffin's book, we know what Catharine at least looked like. Otherwise, she probably would seem like a ghost. In 2016, 1966, here at what became the State Historic Site, the house, the Coffin home, was purchased by the state of Indiana, made into the State Historic Site. And by 2016, although up till 2016, it was always the Levi Coffin home. And so in 2016, when the site reopened with our new interpretive center, it was decided to rename the site the Levi and Catharine Coffin State Historic Site so that we may emphasize to all visitors Catharine's part in the story, in the history. This year, Catharine's been honored with a special postage stamps, and both she and Levi will be inducted into the National Abolition Hall of Fame in Peterborough, New York later this fall. So tonight's program continues that work to try to give Catharine her due, but is only what I see as a beginning in trying to find new ways in telling her story and perspective. And hopefully this evening I've been able to help expand Catharine's experience beyond the walls of this building as we tell her story and in the house next door. So we'll continue to look beyond history and find ways to make sure we always include her story. So, all right, so you listened to me long enough. I am happy to try to answer questions. There's a lot that I actually cut out of this because I didn't want us here all night. I had to realize I'm not writing a thesis, I'm doing a presentation. So, but I want to see what questions, if anybody has any tonight.
Janice,
Nope.
when we went to Cincinnati that time, didn't we go in the museum and see that painting?
Yes.
In the Museum of Art. So I will be in Cincinnati in May. I don't know if I'll make it to the art museum, but I'm going to try to make it to Spring Grove to see their gravesite. So, yeah. Yes, I might do that. So, yes.
I don't know this as as a historical thing. Are there burdens of proof that are required for saying that a home was part of the Underground Railroad, since so much of it is undocumented?
Right. So that, yes. So we have that benefit here that we have this. I don't know where my picture went, but we have this this book that Coffin chose to write, and I honestly believe if he hadn't written the book, the house may not be standing today. And there are people who come to me all the time and say, I grew up in this house, or have you heard, like today I had someone from, Ohio who said, are you familiar with this story? I'm looking at him because he was one of them. And it's always difficult to say, one, I haven't heard all the stories, so I don't know them all. But I do try to give people an idea of where they can try to research. Now, when it comes to burden of proof, I don't find myself as an expert to be able to go and say this, So it's important to have primary resources where you can. A lot of times, if there is a resource, it's probably a secondary resource. But do your best to try to find those details that you can follow up on and try to get more of a primary resource if you can. That's important.
How I ended up here tonight was my grandparents' house was family lore was that it was part of the Underground Railroad. I live in Westfield.
Okay, yeah.
And, I just got a bee in my bonnet one day and was like, I'm going to research it. We're going to figure this out once and for all. My grandma just passed away, so family history, all of that. And I looked at the plats from 1832 and 1866, and I found their plat. And then Caddy Corner was owned by L. Coffin. And I was like, oh, is this like Levi Coffin? So I messaged our historical society and was like, is this Levi Coffin? And they said they don't think it's Levi Coffin.
Sure.
And before that, it was by Moses Coffin in 1832. He was the one who got the land grant. But I did find out that their property was allegedly in Westfield lore, part of the Underground Railroad.
Okay.
But they can't tell me why they think that. They don't. It's just oral history, but I don't know. So anyway.
Tom, do you have an opinion? Because you're shaking your head a lot.
Oh, I love the head shake.
There was a Levi Coffin who lived in Westfield who was a cousin.
I figured
much
they were
younger.
related.
Yeah.
They're both from North Carolina in
Yeah.
the same area, so I
Right.
figured.
And it certainly is plausible that you would have had a number of houses in Westfield that were involved with the Underground
Yeah,
Railroad. Since
yeah.
it was a major Quaker center, it was
Yeah.
a major anti-slavery
Mm-hmm.
center.
Yeah. It
So,
was allegedly a barn that was on
Okay.
the property, and so I'm just trying to figure out the connection.
and that, I'm sorry to say, that might be all you'll get. Because even as much as what we do know, there's still a lot that we don't know. So then we're in the position of trying to find those answers. And like I said before, with the way the house is built, we'll probably never have an answer.
Yeah.
You know, maybe Catherine just wanted a summer kitchen to cook in when it was really hot outside. I mean, that's a plausible explanation. So, but it's kind of hard to but you're doing the right thing, like looking at your local sources, because normally I tell folks, if you're not going to find it in like, you know, you got to go to your county historian, look at the county history books that have been written. That was very popular around 1900. People were writing county histories and that kind of stuff. Start there. And then you might find yourself with a lot of dead ends, but you also might find yourself with some plausibility too. So it's, as Tom says, there's a likelihood that there's a connection there.
Sure.
So I wish I could give everybody the answer they want. It's hard when you get a person, and sometimes I ask this question when they talk about a home. I say, well, when was the home built? It was built in 1875. Well, then it couldn't. I mean, it just doesn't time out right. So I hate bursting those bubbles. So, but it sounds like you're on the track of something.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's a good research project.
And that's how a lot of this is. It's either town lore, family lore, because a lot of these are, I mean, Levi himself never intended to write a book. He didn't seem very interested in that, but he got talked into it. So, yeah, if everybody had done that, imagine how much more we would know.
Yeah, right. The
So-
Quakers did their job on keeping good records.
I know, for the most part.
Yes.
So, but I have problems sometimes with the way Levi has written his book. Like, couldn't you just put a date in here? Couldn't you have, you know, anyway. But he's not a historian. He would have never imagined this is what we're using his house for today. That we are touring thousands of people through it every year, telling these stories. He would have never imagined that.
He would have left us a piece of furniture.
Maybe, right. We don't even have the house is our object. That's what we focus on. So, yes.
Well, I always like the story about the bench that you can rock and sew.
Uh-huh.
Now you're
The
talking about
mammy?
sewing.
Sewing, yes. That seems to be something she's very committed to. So it would be nice. And now the Cincinnati Sewing Circle, I almost put this in and then I took it out. But I don't know if there's a debate or what, because I find some sources that say Catherine started it and sources that say Sarah Ernst started it. And Sarah didn't seem to like it very much. I mean, she did it because that's what was available at the time. And I'm thinking if she didn't seem to be doing it where she came from Massachusetts, perhaps, I need to look into it. So I think it's pretty much Catherine driving it. But there's some sources that try to give her, Sarah Ernst, the credit there. But her credit really is in the anti-slavery conventions that got formed and the fundraising end of things. That's really what she was good at. Like I said, Catherine's good at organizing and things and dispersing them and making sure they're getting to the people that need to have them.
So did the house, when they left here, did they sell it? And did it pass?
No. So because the Coffins thought they were returning, Levi continued to own it. He put it into a trust. So it's interesting. So another thing, it's like if they did come back to Jackson County, like I said, it makes sense that the sons are there, but they still own this house here in Fountain City. I mean, they could have if they wanted. If the store failed in Cincinnati or he closed it, they could have come back here, and that never happened. So he didn't sell it until 1866, after the war ended. So again, we don't know why he held on to it as long as he did. And, you know, again, there's a thought that we know he was renting it out. He's making an income off of it, probably going into that trust. And so it's possible whoever he's renting to, perhaps, we know the Underground Railroad continued in his absence here in town. Perhaps there's a role there happening. We just may never be able to prove it. You gotta have the record, right? So, So we may never know. But it's just kind of interesting. He held on to it as long as he could. When he could have either sold it, taken that income back to Cincinnati, moved back here, and resumed his life in Indiana. But that choice didn't happen. So, yeah.
You've done an excellent job, but I have one quote I want to share.
Okay.
I sometimes use in my
Yes.
When they had their 50th wedding anniversary down in Cincinnati, the meeting down there apparently threw a little like punch and cake reception for them. And Levi was asked to speak about their days on the Underground Railroad. Now, these people have spent half a century together with life's ups and downs and all that. And the most complimentary thing he said about her was she didn't scare worth a cent.
Well, you'll have to give me the source for that, Mary Louise, if you don't mind. I'm sure there's a few more things I could find. Newspapers have been a great help in this, especially, like I said.
I thought that was such a backhand.
It is. She doesn't scare easy. I believe it, though. I believe that. So, anything else?
So if they belong to Driftwood, that means in 1858, they could have once been members of Western Yearly Meeting since it was founded in 1858.
Okay. I'm not a Quaker historian. I rely on other people to help me with that. So, yeah. Tom's the one that brought me the source saying from the Cincinnati monthly meeting that they wanted to leave Driftwood and join. Oh, so Driftwood, the Sand Creek Azalea meeting, do still have their written meeting notes. They keep it in a safe. It's protected. But I found a video, I think it was filmed in 2016, that one of their members got a chance to read the meeting minutes. And she brings up Levi and Catharine had joined the meeting. She also noted that when Levi went to Europe, he applied for a certificate that basically says I'm a Quaker in good standing, so that he went to Great Britain and traveled and stuff. He could say, look, I'm a Quaker in good standing. And he had to return it to the monthly meeting when he came back. So they have that record as well. So again, it shows that there's something there too, with whatever's happening in Jackson County. So again, we'll have to see if we can find anything else.
So is the letter, the traveling minute, is it signed by the various meetings that he?
I don't know. I don't know if they still have that.
I
do you know?
think there's just a record.
A record
in the
that it was
monthly
given,
meeting
yeah.
minutes that he returned his traveling minute, which
yeah.
was satisfactory to the meeting.
Yeah. So, but I believe that's the only mentions of Levi and then of Catharine joining. Those are the only records within the meeting minutes that they had of the Coffins. So, but still, it shows that they were there. So.
And remind me again, where and what was she doing while he was in England?
It sounds like she's in Indiana based off of that letter he wrote when he returned on his trip. It just sounds like, and their daughter Sarah was still alive, so she seems to be with her. So I don't know if it's something where, yeah, I'm going to be gone for a year. Does it make sense to stay in Cincinnati? Why don't we just spend time with family? She is a grandmother by this time too. Maybe that has something to do with it. Grandmother's going to spend time with grandchildren. Like I said, does she need a break?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all reached that point. We all hit a wall. Did she need a break? Was Sarah, their daughter, ill? Did it make sense to leave Cincinnati and go to the country? I mean, there's a lot of possibilities that we could look at. Again, we just may never be able to confirm it, but she seems committed with spending time with her sons in Jackson County. So.
What was he doing? Raising money or speaking?
He was mostly raising money with the Quakers in Britain and Ireland, and he did end up in France at some point. I can't remember if there's somewhere else, and I could be wrong, but can't remember every detail. That book's so thick. But that's what he returned supposedly with, like the equivalent, well, $100,000 in the money at that time. He said is what he raised.
And he tried, I think he did, get some of the money from the Gurney family. And the Gurney family grew up at Earl Hall. And they're connected. No, not ours, but one of them.
For which Erwin was named.
Yeah, okay. So.
Now, I've seen accounts of his public speaking when he was in England in 1864 and 65, and a couple of times people said that he was not a great public speaker.
He didn't like doing it. Yeah.
his commitment to the slave was so well known that
Yeah.
he was still followed with
Yeah.
rapt attention.
Well, and it's interesting in his book, Catherine is the one that encourages Levi to go on this trip. Like, you need a break from what you're doing. Maybe she's trying to get him out of the house. I have no idea, but she's encouraging him to do this trip. She thinks it'll be good for his health. So, and then he comes back not feeling great and needing to take a break from this trip because he got ill on it. So, anyway, yeah, Levi he detested speaking, public speaking. That, as an abolitionist, that's not what he wanted to do.
Well, Samuel Gurney was considered one of maybe the wealthiest men in England at that time. So he went right to the top.
Yeah.
To get the money.
Yep. So, all right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all for coming. Maybe in a couple years I'll have it all memorized and I won't have to read it.